And so finding something where we can hone in on a couple of verses about marriage and fighting for your marriage is sparse and very difficult in the text. But as the previous session pointed out to us, there are a couple of verses in the book of Nehemiah where something is mentioned about families. And I want to read that, Nehemiah chapter 4. If you were here for the previous session, you probably read that with us. But I want to read Nehemiah 4, verses 10 and following, and then we'll launch into this message about fighting for your marriage. Chapter 4, verse 10. Meanwhile, the people in Judah said, "The strength of the laborers is giving out, and there is so much rubble that we cannot rebuild the wall." Also our enemies said, "Before they know it or see us, we will be right there among them and will kill them and put an end to the work." Then the Jews who lived near them came and told us 10 times over, "Wherever you turn, they will attack us." Therefore I stationed some of the people behind the lowest points of the wall at the exposed places, posting them by families with their swords, spears, and bows. After I looked things over, I stood up and said to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people, "Don't be afraid of them. Remember the Lord who is great and awesome," and here it comes, "and fight for your brothers and your sons and your daughters," and here it comes, "your wives and your homes." So I completely understand the idea behind the concept of fighting for. We have sat on our laurels too long where we fought for everything else under the sun but for our families. We've allowed companies to go out into our law courts to fight on our behalf. We've allowed the law courts to make decisions about our current affairs within our families and the future of our families and the future of our marriages. I say it is time for the church to stand up and families in the church to begin to stand up and fight for our marriages. Listen to the voices of those who are blogging, who are not of the moral mindset that you and I are of. A Huffington Post blogger by the name of Lisa Haisha, and it'll come up on the screen for you, wrote this in July 2014. She asked the question as if she wants to put doubt in people's minds about God's creation plan for marriage. Is it time to change our views of adultery and marriage? She says, clearly the concept of marriage has changed greatly over the years, and with today's rate of divorce between 40 and 50%, coupled with the prevalence of adultery in many marriages, perhaps it's time for the concept of marriage to continue to evolve. Are you kidding me? She says, according to the Associated Press Journal of Marriage and Family Therapy, which I prescribed to and sent to me because I belong to this organization, 41% of spouses admit to infidelity, either physical or emotional, sexual or just having a nice affair with fuzzy and warm feelings. And this leads me to ask, she says, are we really supposed to be with just one person our whole life? If not, must we get remarried 5 times? And here is the toughest of all. Are there alternative ways to perceive and participate in marriage that will guarantee its success? And her thinking about alternative ways is go beyond just a monogamous marriage and have a kind of marriage where everybody can be fulfilled no matter what they do in or outside of the marriage. These people are feeding the world with their crazy, immoral ideas. And so does this next person, the name of Richard Dawkins. You've heard of Richard Dawkins, evolutionary biologist, also an atheist, screams against God, screams against anything that is moral and religious or godlike. Listen to him. And he says this in response to what happened to a British television personality that was caught having an affair. In fact, his wife sent a detective to spy out and watch him, and they caught him in an affair. And Dawkins stood up for this guy and tried to defend him by spewing out a new philosophy for marriage. Listen to his words. I want to raise another question, he says, that interests me. Why are we so obsessed with monogamous fidelity in the first place? The underlying presumption that is a human being has some kind of property rights over another human being's body is unspoken because it is assumed to be obvious, but with what justification? And then he addresses wives who perhaps have been violated, who perhaps have been betrayed by husbands who are having affairs. He says this to wives. Come on, wives. He says, you must rise above your evolved nature to feel betrayed when hubby has a mistress. He says, you being jealous is immoral and it is selfish. Instead, you must rise above your jealousy and selfishness and be more altruistic by letting him have his fun. How biblical. Why should you deny your loved one the pleasure of sexual encounters with others if he or she is that way inclined? I, for one, feel drawn to the idea that there is something noble and virtuous in rising above nature in this way. These are the voices, folks, that are influencing the minds of our young people, influencing the minds of our world. Come on, get with it, wives. Get to your better self and evolve. Allow your husband to have sex with another woman outside of your marriage. And where's our voices? There was one, though, that I admired. When this whole decision came down in 2015 by the divided Supreme Court, who voted 5-4, that same-sex marriage is okay and must now be allowed. And DOMA, Defense of Marriage Act, which was instituted in 1996, must be obliterated and destroyed. DOMA defended against same-sex marriage because they wanted the traditional marriage, the way it has always been, to continue healthily for all families and for all marriages, struck down in 2015. Did you know that in 2003, from 2003 to 2007, only one state in the Union admitted same-sex marriage, and that was Massachusetts. We get to about 2014, 49 states moved that direction. And by 2015, the floodgates were open. The floodgates to the Jerusalem of marriage were destroyed and opened, and now anything goes. And Mark Galli, who writes in Christianity Today in response to that decision of the Supreme Court, said this to the churches: we lost this one. We and many others made the case to our culture that traditional marriage is God's good design, that this institution embodied by a man and a woman joining together leads to social flourishing. But our culture is not convinced. And much to our disappointment, it is now the law of the land to permit other forms of marriage. And I echo his voice by saying, yes, folks, we lost this one. We lost that one. And I'm wondering how much the church should not have stood up and made our voices known. I wonder if we were all silent about that. Now, I love all people. I work with all kinds of people. I counsel with gay and lesbian and all kinds. I've done that for the last 20 years. But I'm saddened by the fact that we've opened the floodgates. And we have what we see in these pictures all over the world. And some of us even maybe clap hands and applaud when things like that happen. And so I'm here to remind us, folks, and this is not a hate speech at all. It is simply a call to arms for the church. It's nothing perhaps you and I can do now to reverse that law. And there may be someone who comes along and will do something about it. But where we are in our congregations, in our communities, we better get back to the basics of what marriage is all about and what God says about it. We must teach this to our children and to our grandchildren and continue to read the Word of God from its inception in Genesis 1, 2 and 3 to remind them of why God instituted this great thing called marriage. Because marriage is now lying in ruins and lying under the rubble like Jerusalem in Nehemiah's time. And I believe that the church can no longer blush and hide from what we are seeing and feeling and experiencing in our culture and more painfully in our own congregations. And there may be some in this audience whose grandchildren and children are struggling with these issues. I'm not condemning your children or your grandchildren. I'm saying to us, we must take up arms and we must take the responsibility to begin and teach again what God says about marriage. Marriage gates have been plundered and burnt and destroyed, and the walls have been rammed, broken, and rendered insecure. And what are we going to do about that? Nehemiah knew exactly what to do when he saw his city in ruins and under rubble, and the people suffering, and the future of the people suffering, because the gates and the walls and the towers on those walls have been destroyed. He showed, firstly, Nehemiah showed concern. And we are called to show concern. He said, I question, Nehemiah chapter 1, verses 1 and 2, I question them about the Jewish remnant that survived the exile and also about Jerusalem. He questioned, he was concerned. He didn't just say, oh, it's that family over there who's got that issue. No, he was concerned about his people, about the nation, about the families in Jerusalem. He didn't have to be concerned, but he was. And so we went about uncovering their condition, uncovering the condition of the exiles, and saw that they were in great trouble and disgrace. And the wall of Jerusalem, metaphorically speaking, marriages were broken down and its gates have been burned with fire. He showed genuine concern, not fearing the reality that you and I, that he would face to create some change. It's time for each individual family to begin to show concern about the state of marriages. But secondly, Nehemiah showed contrition. Chapter 1, verses 3 through 4. It says, he sat down, he wept, he mourned for days. And then he fasted and prayed to the God of heaven over the condition of his people and the condition of Jerusalem. It's time for us to show some mourning because we were quiet. And then Nehemiah confessed. And I wonder, chapter 1, verses 6 through 7, it says, 1, 6 through 7. Let your ear be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer your servant is praying before you day and night for your servants, the people of Israel. I confess the sins we Israelites, including myself and my father's house, have committed against you. We have acted wickedly toward you. We have not obeyed the commands, decrees, and laws you gave your servant Moses. We've walked away from your word, God. And I want to confess as a father, I want to confess as a husband, that I'm just so to blame for the condition of marital Jerusalem. Like everybody else, I'm just so to blame. And I want to confess my sins and the sins of my people, including my father's household. I too was swept away with the rebellious trend of my culture. I too was silent when I had to speak up and out. I too ignored people when I clearly saw their struggles and crossing the line in their marriages. I too showed no concern for them violating the word of God and losing respect to be faithful in their marriages and committed to their marriages. I too said absolutely nothing when I saw the condition of marriages in my church spiraling down and not doing anything about it. I confess. Sometimes we are totally aware of marital couples' downward spiraling condition, but we say and do nothing. Sometimes we are aware of people living together, cohabiting, and we know and hear that they are not married, but we say nothing for fear they will leave the church or they'll think something negative about us. And I want to remind each of us that he that knows to do good and does not do it, to him it is sin. It is time for us to wake up to the condition of our culture, the condition of our society. There are great things happening in our culture. There are great things happening in our society. But sometimes we just neglect to be totally aware of the way we are being dragged in and dragged down by the way our culture is moving. I know preachers and leaders and members who are all guilty for not saying, doing anything, or not raising consciousness about what is righteous and what is godly for marriages. I, Alan, need to confess my part and my contribution to the way things are today. And then, fourthly and lastly, that's my responsibility toward the theme using Nehemiah. Nehemiah then moves into action. And I'm not going to read the verses for now. It's chapter 2, and you've heard a lot this morning. Up to this point, they've done a good job introducing my sermon for me, so I'm not going to go there. Folks, it was not just enough for him to stand there and be concerned and show contrition and confess. He went about doing something, and he says something about his action. This action was not coming just out of Nehemiah. This action was actually God-motivated. He says in chapter 2, I had not told anyone, listen to this, I had not told anyone what my God had put in my heart, listen, to do for Jerusalem. It's time for us to do some things. I have the privilege of going to a lot of churches and doing little seminars. I call them it's weekend little seminars. I think to date I've done probably 100 of those things. And I usually ask this question to elders and to preachers. How many times a year do you have a very intentional plan to educate and address the church in the area of family? What percentage of your teaching and your preaching involves educating your families and challenging your families and helping your families with marriages and helping the kids to develop well and healthily and helping those grandchildren as we have during this particular lectureship? What percentage of your entire curriculum, preaching curriculum and teaching, is devoted to dealing with family? And I promise, and I kid you not, that's less than 2%. Families fall apart. Everything else falls apart, folks. Nehemiah was going to move into action to do something about it. The precise action was not to build a wall, not to build gates, not to build towers, but to fundamentally restore the gates and the walls and the towers. Jerusalem needed restoration, and I'm convinced of this as I move about in churches and I'm dealing with people every single day of my life now, that marriages need restorations. And we must all commit ourselves with heart, mind, mouth, and body to fight, to take up arms, to say to the elders and say to our leaders, we need more marriage education in our church. We need more family education in our church. We need more grandchildren education in our church. All of the topics we talk about, wonderful. But we need more education of marriages and families in our churches, because I promise you, some of our churches are falling apart because we have major divorces and major separations and major things happening. That's just a sign of our walls breaking down and our gates being flung open, and it's rendering us weak. So, that was all introduction. Now for the lesson. Now I'm only kidding, I'm halfway there. So what do we do? What do we do? Now I can stand up here and talk about, aspects of good and bad communication today. I can talk about how to do good sex and what is bad sex. And I can talk about personal habits and so on, and stress and conflict resolution. And you probably expected that. But let me say, I think the best thing to do to restore again God's voice into marriages is to go back to the fundamentals. When a great basketball player, for some reason, you go to a game and you expect him to perform as great as he always does, and during that game he's just off. He just loses it. And you go and you look at your mate next to you, and you, instead of high fives, you go with frowns on your forehead, and you say to, what's going on with Michael Jordan today? Some of you kids don't even know who Michael Jordan is. But that was my hero during the basketball days of the late 80s and 90s. What's going on with Jordan today? He's not performing. And so afterwards they interviewed Jordan, and he said, and then, last 5 minutes of the last quarter, all of a sudden Michael turns it around, and he comes and he plays an exciting match, and he actually scores the winning, gets the winning basket for the game. And when everyone's like, wow, what happened? They interview Michael, and he says, I realized that everybody was expecting me to do the fantastic and the fancy. And it was at that moment when I was doing so badly, couldn't get a ball in the basket. It was at that moment that I came to this realization. I need to go back to the fundamentals. And when I did that, he said, it just turned around. And I think it's time for us to restore the walls and the gates. And there were towers on those walls to restore those things to their fundamentals. Number one, 4 quick things. We must restore God's creation mandate for marriage. Genesis 1:27, so God created man in His own image. In the image of God, He created him. Listen, male and female, He created them. We need to teach God's creation mandate over and over and over again. Each day that God created something, He said it was good. But on that 6th day when He created man, that's man and woman, in companionship and in a covenant relationship, God saw that it was very good. Why, God? You see, the various elements of creation are good in that they match appropriately according to God's intention. They serve exactly the purpose for which they were created. And each element that God created totally fulfilled their God-created role to balance and sustain life on the earth, to glorify the magnificence and the great wisdom of God. And so the creation mandate and the mind of God concept is simply this. From the beginning is simply this. What is the creation mandate and what is the mind of God concept? Male and female, He created them. And the creation mandate for marriage is not male and male, it's not female and female. But God's creation mandate for marriage is male and female. He created them. The Holy Spirit spends about 1.2 chapters telling us about all of the elements of creation. But He spends 1.8 chapters giving us the details. They didn't write in chapters. I'm just making that up as I go along here because I'm looking at chapters in our Bibles. He spends 1.8 chapters giving us the details of man's creation, man's loneliness, and then creating a companion for man, not another man, but a female. And I want to remind the church that these are the created genders for the marital mandate. And I want to remind the church that the creation mandate is the gate of marriage. And if these gates do not remain protected and secure, then any arrangement can substitute for male and female relationship. We must protect the gates and not swing it wide open. And I think we need to restore this beginning fundamental concept in the minds of our children and repeatedly read Genesis 1 through 3 to your children every single day so that they don't know anything else but what God says about His creation mandate, why He created male and why He created female on the face of the earth. To be companions for each other in that heterosexual relationship. I want to say to the church that God's original marital arrangement is not up for grabs. I want to be very logical about this. Imagine changing the purpose and the function of the sun or the moon or the stars. What would happen to us? And what would happen to our world? And what would happen to our universe? You see, being the sun and the moon, they had their functions and they had their roles very specifically. That was not up for grabs to change that. The universe and the world depend on the faithfulness of these created elements to their creation mandate. And the same is true about God's creation mandate for male and female. And God is not going to be pleased with any nation or any government or any supreme body to alter the creation mandate and roles of His creation. Folks, God's creation is based on His infinite wisdom. And for us to change that nilly-willy and allow people to change that nilly-willy and we stand back and we are silent, is something to be reconsidered. Number 2, we must restore the gates first. But secondly, we must restore God's creation purpose for marriage. That's the reason a man will leave his father and his mother and be united to his wife, and that the two of them will become one flesh. All Hebrew scholars will tell you that this verse has in it the roots of covenant language. That word leave has the roots of covenant language in it. That word united has the roots of covenant language in it. See, God, when He brought that female to the male, He took the initiative to create her, but then He took the initiative as a father to bring her to Adam and to place her in His arms for covenant marriage. And what I mean by covenant marriage, it is not a man-made thing. This is a God thing. This is a God saying to the wife and saying to the husband, you are in this for good. You are in this for life. And don't mess with my covenant. You see, the purpose of marriage is not merely for sex or for bringing forth children or procreation, as we would say. It's not even just for happiness. It's not just for the eradication of loneliness. No, the purpose of marriage, folks, we must get back to this fundamental idea of God. The purpose for marriage is much higher than all of that. It is for you and I to commit to a faithful, covenant-keeping relationship for all of life. The purpose of marriage is to put on display faithful covenant-keeping between husband and wife as they fulfill the purpose of God. Malachi chapter 2 verse 10. Have we not all one Father? Did not one God create us? Why do we profane the covenant of our fathers by breaking faith with one another? And he follows that in chapter 2 of Malachi verse 14 by saying, God no longer pays any attention to all your tears and your sacrifices. You ask, why doesn't God give us any attention? It is because the Lord is acting as the witness between you and your wife, the wife of your youth, because you have broken faith with her, though she is your partner, the wife, listen, of your marriage covenant. God's mad. Because you're not living up to the covenant qualifications of God. You're not living up to the creation, mandate, purpose of God. Living faithfully with your wife. Faithfully with your husband. And so I want to say to the church, we must teach our couples. We must restore God's purpose. Marriage is not a nilly-willy contract. No, marriage is a God covenant you step into with your partner to display the infinite wisdom and purpose of God. No man came up with this idea. Marriage is God's doing. For covenanting, you see, is the protective wall of our marriages. We break this, and the enemy can march right into this sacred covenant relationship and tear it up. And church, we must protect it. Many in the ancient nation of Israel were lost to eternity because they despised God's covenant, and that's clear now from the book of Nehemiah. In fact, God warned them in the book of Deuteronomy. Read the blessings and the curses, and then go to Deuteronomy chapter 29 and read what God said would happen to them if they start running after other gods, if they start committing adultery, if they start breaking the covenant and becoming unfaithful. Read what God says would happen, and where they found themselves when they were in Babylon, when they were in Assyria, and then coming out, is exactly what God said would happen. So, folks, staying in our marriage is not about staying in happiness and love, but more about staying in covenant. And when we stay in covenant the way we should, the way Christ covenants with us, the way God covenants with His people, always faithful, always merciful, always full of grace, and always loving toward us, things will go well. Beyond happiness, we'll find true joy. But we must remain in covenant relationship. And let me then move to the third thing, and then I'll move to the fourth thing fairly quickly, because we're running out of time. We've got 5 minutes. We must restore God's creation function of marriage. So creation mandate we must restore, creation purpose we must restore, and then thirdly we must restore God's creation function of marriage. And what is this function? Let me sum it up very quickly. You see, marriage was not established in the Garden of Eden, and then later on when Christ established the church, God based Christ and His relationship with the church on marriage. Didn't work that way. Doesn't work that way. Christ was already slain in the mind of God before the creation of the world, Revelation chapter 13, verse 8. That plan was already in God's infinite mind before the world ever began. So when Adam and Eve was placed together, God had in His mind the future. What was coming? It was Christ and His relationship, His covenant relationship with His church. He's faithful as a husband to His church. He's loving unconditionally of His wife with His church. Marriage is based on that. And that's what Paul talks about in Ephesians chapter 5. And he says it very explicitly. Ephesians chapter 5, verses 31 and 32 is on your screen. For this reason a man will leave father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. This is a profound mystery. Listen to this. But I am talking about Christ and the church. He's not just discussing marriage. He's talking about Christ's relationship with the church. And he's really, in essence, saying, if all marriages are based in function upon that perfect eternity model, then things will go well. And we must teach our church, we must teach our families, we must teach all of our couples that that is God's creation function for marriage. Model Christ in the church. You see, let me say this. I get excited about this because when I thought about this, I thought, man, this is so true. That Jesus now for 2,100 years did not renegotiate the marriage contract with each believer. He stepped into it with them. He's not going to leave. He's not going to renegotiate. Jesus, when He stepped in, is not going anywhere. He's not looking for a second bride. He only has one. So much more to say, but we got 1 second, 2 seconds left. Let me just wrap up by saying this. Finally, last restoration is to restore the creation honor of marriage. And I call these the towers on the walls. Honor. If the towers are destroyed or lying under rubble, then no one is keeping watch to warn of the enemies coming in and infiltrating. Because the sentries are all AWOL. Gone. Not on the lookout. And what do we mean by restoring that honor? Christians, men and women, are wandering too easily into affairs and adultery with no conscience whatsoever. No fears whatsoever, no remorse whatsoever, no repentance whatsoever. And we are quiet and we are not saying anything or preaching anything about it. We are too afraid to offend people. And our culture and our movies and our comedies and our major news have desensitized us to the wrongs of society with respect to purity and holiness in our marriage. And the Hebrews writer clearly says, marriage should be honored by all, and the marriage bed kept pure. For God will judge the adulterer and all the sexually immoral. And let me just list this, and then I'm going to close. We must restore a Christian holiness within our marriages and bring consciousness to cohabitation, which, by the way, is 56% of all marriages are now preceded by cohabitation. Bring consciousness to fornication. By the way, that rate is up. That's sex before marriage. Bring consciousness to adultery. That rate is up. Bring consciousness to one-night stands. That rate is up. Bring consciousness to emotional affairs. That rate is up. And we must bring consciousness to sexual purity and pornography and any and everything that mars holiness within our marriages. We must restore God's creation mandate, male and female. We must restore God's purpose for marriage, covenant keeping. We must restore the function, God's creation function for marriage, base it on Christ and the church. And we must restore the honor of holiness to all of our marriages. And may God bless us and help us to do just that.